So what we're going to try to do is an overview of the story of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, leading up to Jesus. And we're going to try to do that in just a few minutes. Again, this is just an overview, just the skeleton outline of what the big story is of the Bible and how everything anticipates Jesus. We begin in the book of Genesis, which is our book of beginnings, and that is with creation. I realize this is low tech, but I'm going to be using a laser pointer here to help guide us along. Creation, we have humans as the apex of that creation, and they are different than the other elements of the creation because they are created in the image of God. Now, along with that comes some responsibility. They have moral choice. There is the possibility that they could sin, because there is a tree in the garden that is there that they are told not to eat of, but they are to eat of every other tree that God has given them. It also means that there is responsibility. They are expected to cultivate that creation and to keep it. So there is a principle there of stewardship that is set up from the very beginning. But of course, if you get on into the next chapter, Genesis 3, this is where sin enters into the picture. It's often said that the first two chapters of the Bible and the last two chapters of the Bible are where paradise is, and the rest of it is the mess that happens when we are alienated. We alienate ourselves, separate ourselves from God. Sin happens here. It is because both the man and the woman have given into temptation. They have sinned, and therefore there is also a fall that comes about from that sin. Along with that fall and this curse, there is the idea of death that enters into the world. Adam and Eve are no longer immortal. There is a lifespan now and a death that comes to play in the picture. Now, as part of this curse that is given, even the earth itself is cursed. Cursed be the ground because of you. And this curse that is given in three parts: to the man, to the woman, and to the serpent. And so all three of those set up the brokenness of the world that we still live in today. And it's a pattern that we each repeat. Now, in the midst of all this judgment language, we have a typical Bible pattern. That is, in the midst of judgment, we still have hope. We have a prophecy in Genesis 3:15 that in the midst of this, and in the midst of the pain and the conflict that are going to ensue between the descendants of Satan, or the followers of Satan, the seed of Satan, and the seed of woman, there will ultimately be a victor in that conflict, and it's going to be the seed of woman. And specifically, this is not just looking to mankind in general, or even just to a nation. The way the New Testament interprets this is that this is looking to a particular person. We call this a messianic prophecy because that's an expression that contains the term Messiah. Messiah means anointed one in Hebrew. The Greek term is Christ. And of course, this is someone who is expected to come and to be a king, and not only a king, but a savior, a type of deliverer. And so there is an expectation that builds throughout the Old Testament that someone in particular is coming. And he is coming to put what has been broken back to right, to bring justice back, to bring healing, to bring redemption from all this that has happened. And we are told that in Genesis 3:15, it sets it up, that the seed of woman, one person in particular, is coming, and even though he's going to be bruised on the heel by Satan and by his seed, ultimately he will crush the head of Satan. And of course, this is anticipating not only the death of Jesus, but also his resurrection and his ascension, his triumph over Satan whenever we get to the character of Jesus in the New Testament. Now from there, this is one of those judgment passages, but in the midst of it there is hope. We have a major judgment section that happens with the global flood in Genesis 6 through 9. Basically, we are told about the evil that has really taken root in the world at that point. And we have God finding Noah and his family faithful. So 8 people are saved from this global flood. And basically, they're truly saved from the unrighteousness around them through these waters of purification, if you think of it in that sense. And out of purification, we have a type of death, burial, and resurrection, because the same language of creation that was used before is now going to be used again after the flood. It's a new start. It's a new start with a remnant of God's righteous people, and that is Noah and his family. Now, Noah was a sinner. So was Adam. So was Eve. So just because we say this is a righteous remnant does not mean they are not sinners. It just means that they are staying in a covenant relationship with God. Speaking of covenant relationship, the next major character that we meet is Abraham. He's named Abram when we first encounter him. He's in a city, Ur of the Chaldeans, to the east, but God's going to call him west. And he's going to say that I've got 3 promises that I'm going to give to you as part of this covenant that I'm making with you. Covenant is a relationship, and it is a contract. It's a relationship that's built on promises. The 3 promises that he makes specifically to Abraham is that I'm going to take you to a land. Ultimately, that land will be the land of Canaan. I'm going to make a great nation out of your descendants. Okay, so they're going to become a multitude of people over time, and history bears that out, how that happens. And then thirdly, through your seed, I'm going to bless all the nations of the earth. So this is not just about the nation that he is making of Abraham and his descendants. Ultimately, he is using this family to bring about someone, this seed, who is going to bless all the nations. So God is thinking globally, even here in this promise to Abraham. Now, this is the same language that was used over here in Genesis 3:15, which was the first messianic prophecy. And of course, that seed language continues with Abraham. What we're developing is a seed line, a path of the seed or descendants that comes through Adam, through Noah, through Abraham, ultimately through Abraham's nation and all the way down to Jesus, who we'll get to in just a moment. But Abraham goes to the land where God is going to show him, and then when he gets there, of course, he has to wonder, well, how's this going to come about? Beautiful story, powerful story of how God enables Abraham and his wife Sarah to have children even when they're not able to. And of course, that child of promise, the one through whom the seed line is going to come, ultimately is Isaac. Isaac has a couple of sons. The one through whom the seed line is going to come is the younger one, and that is Jacob. God changes Jacob's name to Israel at an important moment in his life when he comes to have a mature faith and is willing to follow on in that covenant relationship with God. Israel, of course, becomes the name of this nation. Now, there's something that's important at the end of Jacob's life. Jacob has 12 sons. And of these sons, we have various stories. One of them, named Joseph, is the reason why they end up down in Egypt. But first off, there's one named Judah. And on Jacob's deathbed, as he is blessing these sons, he says something important to Judah, who will be the father of the tribe of Judah. Each of these sons are really heads of the tribes. These are enlarged portions of the family, all traced from Abraham. That will be the nation of Israel. But he says the scepter will not depart from Judah. Scepter is a symbol, an image of kingship and of stewardship. And so the leadership of Israel, of this nation, will be centered in the tribe of Judah. It is going to be the tribe of the kings. And of course, this has partial fulfillment with David and with Solomon, who we'll get to in a moment. But ultimately, it's going to have an even greater fulfillment in looking to the one king, the anointed one, the Messiah, who would come from the tribe of Judah. He's called in the book of Revelation the Lion of Judah. And so God's anticipating that already as well. Speaking of Egypt, we have a people that are now in Egypt because there's a famine in the land. One of the sons, Joseph, has risen to power there in Egypt, and he has provided famine prophetically, that he has provided for the famine, grain for not only the nation of Egypt, but surrounding nations to come. And Jacob and his family are one of those surrounding nations. They come, they're reunited with Joseph, who they assume has been dead by now, and they are taken care of in Egypt. But there arises a Pharaoh who does not know Joseph, does not know Jacob, does not know this family. They start seeing these Israelites as a threat. They're starting to grow larger, and so they turn them into slave labor. They use them in their building projects, these mighty projects of Egypt, for a period of about 400 years. So this is the main growth period of the nation of Israel during this time, and they are becoming very populous during this time, so much so that the Egyptians start killing some of their young ones later on as population control, because they start to fear them. So the nation is growing, but not as they wanted to. They are slaves in this land, and they cry out to God for deliverance from this. And so God raises up a deliverer. His name is Moses. Moses is going to lead this Exodus. We have a whole book on this, the second book of the Bible.
And that is the word that means the road. Hadas means the road. Out. Ex means out. It's the exit out of Egypt. And so it's a powerful story of judgments on the Egyptians and how God really reveals himself as the only true God. Even though others might have put their trust in those Egyptian gods or other gods of the world, these plagues show Yahweh's power over all other gods. And so they come out, and there is a covenant that takes place with Moses. We already talked about the Abrahamic covenant. Now there is a Mosaic covenant. Now with this huge nation of people. And so they enter into this covenant with God. It's ratified with blood. It takes place at Mount Sinai in the wilderness. And there is a law that comes with that covenant. And that is the rest of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The rest of Exodus, the whole book of Leviticus, most of Numbers and Deuteronomy are also about the specific law codes of what it was going to mean to live in community with each other as an emancipated people, and also as having God as truly their God and not the gods of the nations around them. Specifically, the ethics that they are to live by are summarized by these 10 commandments, which we can further summarize by Jesus' teaching as love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And that covers what these commandments really mean. Now, there is time that is spent in the wilderness. There ends up being a 40-year wilderness wandering. Now, remember, God had promised the land to Abraham and to his descendants, but they are afraid to take the land. There is war that has to happen to be able to take the land. That is a judgment on the Canaanites who are already in the land, which, if you look on over here, is going to happen in the book of Joshua. Could have happened earlier, but they did not trust that God would be able to do that, and therefore they are faced with 40 years of wandering without a home in the wilderness. They walk around with a tabernacle for the house of God. It's a portable tent that God asked them to set up for him to be able to dwell among them. And there are stipulations for him to be able to dwell among them in his holiness. That's why there's so many purity laws in the Old Testament. But this 40-year period is really so that the untrusting generation will die off. The next generation will have a chance to be different. An important prophecy that Moses gives during this time. He says that there will be a prophet like him who is coming. We're told that in Deuteronomy chapter 18. So there's anticipation, again, of someone who is coming down the road. Now let's step back for just a moment and kind of see where we've been so far. We are on the brink now, finally, of the conquest of the land of Canaan, which we have in the book of Joshua, who's chosen as the next leader after Moses. He leads the conquest of Canaan. This generation overall is faithul. You read of still some hiccups that happen in the book of Joshua, but overall this is a faithful generation. But not so in 2 generations later. By that time, after time of Joshua and the elders of Israel during that time, we have a period of the judges. You say, well, why judges? What does that mean? These are not guys who sit in a courtroom with a gavel, although they do become God's instruments of justice. They often do that not by sitting in a courtroom. Most often, although they do make some judgments in court cases among the people of Israel, they are used as military deliverers. And why would they need delivery? Because even though they're in their land of Canaan now, well, they haven't served God faithfully. They're going to fall into a pattern in the book of Judges, and this is an important pattern that we see repeated in Scripture. It's a pattern that is too often personal to each of us, and that is falling into sin. Sin turns into slavery, which means God brings in another nation to control them, to occupy what should be their home, so they no longer have sovereignty there. They no longer have national sovereignty, and so as a result, now they are back into a type of slavery. They make supplication. They cry out to God for help, and He answers. He sends them salvation, and that is in the form of a judge who enacts justice, delivers them from their oppressors. They again have their national sovereignty, but guess what? Over a period of time, after some time passes, they fall back into sin. And this is a cycle that continues through the book of Judges, and it's very much a cycle that is common to humankind, and we can all be guilty of that. Now there comes a period, this is some years down the road, where they're tired of these judges, they're tired of this cycle. They look at the nations around them, they say, we want to have a king. We want to be like the nations around us and have that. Well, God says, okay, You can have a king, you're not going to like the king once it gets there, and they find that out the hard way. And so we have this united kingdom which takes place for 120 years. Basically that is comprised of three kings. King Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, King David from the tribe of Judah, and then King Solomon from the tribe of Judah. And there are some successes during this time. Saul is not a faithful king. Ultimately, he is driven mad. And David, though, with the exception of some sin in his life, he is still faithful to God. He's obviously a sinner in the need of grace of God, but he's very much respected in the Bible as a man after God's own heart. And God makes a covenant with him. There's a very important covenant which really renews what God had said over here about the scepter not departing from Judah. Now that specifically through the line of David, that promise is going to continue to be worked out as this covenant that he makes with David, that a descendant of his will always sit on the throne. So that's an important one for the Jews, and really in anticipation of Jesus. This has to be a son of David, someone from the line of David who is going to serve in that role. Now, after Solomon, who has some major problems as king, even though the nation flourishes economically during that time, in many ways it begins a process that really takes root in the next generation. And that is when the kingdom is going to divide. And I've got some basic dates up here for some of these events. It divides in 931 BC. We now no longer have a united kingdom of Israel. We have Judah in the south. We have Israel in the north. Israel consists of more tribes, but Judah still maintains more power because they have Jerusalem in the south. And for the most part, it's going to be bad news from this point on. The history really continues to go downhill. There are no faithful kings in Israel that rule over the northern part. Judah has a couple of exceptions. There's going to be a couple of those kings, but for the most part, they are going to depart from serving God as well. And ultimately, here's what's going to happen. We have the northern tribes taken first, taken captive by a foreign nation who God uses as servants, really to bring judgment against his people. He doesn't show special favoritism to his people when they are no longer living as his people, and they've become like the nations, and so there is judgment that happens there. The judgment is going to be delayed on the southern tribes due to a couple of faithful kings and their leadership, but it's going to continue to go downhill in other generations. We have Judah finally taken captive by the Babylonians. They're going to do this in a series of 3 deportations. We have Jerusalem destroyed around the year 587. Some scholars say 587, some say 586. And it's pretty much going to be leveled by the Babylonians. They're going to kill a lot in the process. They're going to take the smartest and the youngest, the bright ones, the ones that they want to keep and to work with them. They're going to take them into captivity, put them to work. And of course, some of these are Daniel and some of his friends. And in a previous captivity, previous deportation, we have Ezekiel, another prophet who is taken. And so we have this period of Babylonian exile. Now, the exile begins to end when Babylon falls to the empire of Persia in 539 BC. We're told of these events in Daniel chapter 5. The book of Daniel is one of these books that is written during the exile. It's a great book about how the people of God live in a culture that is foreign to them, which really is what all of us face, living in a world of which we are not to be conformed to, but yeah, we are still to serve. We are still to see as a mission field, still to love the people who are there. And so we have great principles like that from the exile. But the true return home is going to come a few years later when God moves the Persians to allow the Israelites to go home. And they go home, they rebuild their temple that had been destroyed by the Babylonians. They rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. They try to reestablish the law, understanding the covenant. This is the work of Ezra and Nehemiah, and really Zerubbabel, another character mentioned in the book of Ezra. And there are other prophets that come along in this time as well. What we have then is this intertestamental period. What we mean by that is a time between the testaments. This is about 400 years. That's just a rough number there. And during this time, the history continues. A lot happens to the Jews during this time. They really are only a sovereign nation for a very small part of this between Greek occupation. and Roman occupation. Alexander the Great of the Greeks would eventually conquer that whole region. His kingdom would be divided up into 4 smaller empires to be ruled by his generals. And those are going to war back and forth a little bit over Palestine, which is now what that land of Canaan is called during this time, and until the Jews eventually rebelled. Period of the Maccabees, around 160 BC, when they are going to rebel, and for a time they're going to set up their own sovereign nation, but it's going to be short-lived because another power is rising in the west, and that's going to be the Romans. By the time we get to Jesus, the Romans control all of this. In fact, they control more of the world than any other empire ever had up to that point. And they rule it well. They rule it long term. Other than some of these other kingdoms that were more short-lived, the Romans enact laws and things that will hold people in line, allow them some freedom to practice their religion to an extent, but still have some regulation over that. And so that's the cultural context that brings us to the time of Jesus. But here's what's so great about this whole story. This is told by multiple authors leading up to one particular person that it's all looking to. And here's Jesus. All of these are themes. They are anticipations in the Old Testament. These are just some of them. There is a sense of there is a prophet who is coming. Guess what? That's Jesus. Jesus tells us this in his teachings, as even some thought that John the Baptist was this one prophet that people were looking to. No, the prophet is Jesus. He is the priest. Everything about the priesthood, which we didn't get into in any detail, but everything you read about the priesthood, especially when you read about the high priest and the work of the high priest, that anticipates Jesus. And then he is this king or Messiah, and then he is the deliverer of a new covenant. He is the bringer of a new creation, and he ultimately is the one responsible for reversing the curse. Everything that had taken place from the sin of Adam and Eve, this curse that the world is under, he's reversing it. He